Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our second webinar of the series titled Combating Corruption and the Role of Risk Assessment. This webinar is held as part of the Anti-Corruption Best Practices Programme at the PEL Initiative and is part of a series of webinars being held in collaboration with GoodCorporation. To give you a brief introduction, the PEL Initiative is the region's only non-profit business-led organisation committed to promote corporate culture of accountability and transparency as a key driver of competitiveness. Obviously, in light of the recent public health events, our knowledge sharing events, including our seminars, workshops and roundtables, have all shifted to virtual webcasts. So we're holding these webinars in place of in-person events. But there's still a lot of activity going on in terms of our thought leadership reports and publications, which you can access on our website, as well as all the details of our webinars that are up and coming and past webinars that are on our YouTube channel for on-demand viewing, so to speak. So please, if there are any areas of interest that you think you might miss in terms of webinars, do use those. And also, if there's any areas where you think the PEL Initiative could add value in terms of topics of interest, please do share those with us, and we'll be happy to see how we can support the ecosystem with those. About today's webinar, obviously, anti-bribery and corruption risk assessments are designed to identify systematically the threats to which a company may be exposed. A company that fails to conduct a meaningful corruption risk assessment cannot be confident that its controls are fit for purpose. Risk is integral to future value. Strategic-minded companies do not strive to eliminate risk or even to minimize it. Rather, these enterprises seek to manage risk exposures across all parts of their organization so that at any given time, they incur just enough of the right kinds of risks. To accomplish this, enterprises require a risk assessment process that is practical, sustainable, and easy to understand. Leveraging the expertise and knowledge from our guest speakers today, we aim to discuss the changing regulatory landscape in the area of bribery and corruption, requirements that have been introduced in the area of risk assessment and how companies can overcome the challenges and achieve meaningful assessments of their bribery and corruption risk. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Joining us from the UAE is Dr. Amit Kapoor. He's the head of legal structuring and strategic finance at HSBC. Amit is a lawyer, qualified lawyer in 3 jurisdictions, and has been working in some of the world's largest investment banks for the past 18 years. In his spare time, he lectures in contract finance and corporate law at Murdoch University. Thanks, Amit, for giving up your time and supporting us with this webinar today.
Pleasure to be here.
Joining us as well for this webinar from London is Michael Pollard, Senior Business Ethics Consultant at GoodCorporation. A regular speaker and trainer on business ethics and issues of ethical company culture, Michael has conducted business ethics training sessions and webinars across the MENA region, including, most recently, a day-long workshop on business ethics and compliance with clients and potential clients of the European Bank in Cairo. His experience in the MENA region also includes work in Algeria and Saudi Arabia. Before joining GoodCorporation, Michael worked as the lead researcher and advisor on business ethics to the chair of the Modern Slavery Bill Evidence Review at the UK Parliament. While in Parliament, Michael worked with a number of high-profile UK politicians, government ministers and government suppliers, focusing on business ethics in general and human rights in particular. Thank you, Michael, for presenting to us today as well. Before I hand over to our panelists today, I'd like to point out, we do like to make our webinars as interactive as possible. So we do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function panel, which you'll find on the right of your screen. And I believe Michael will address those with Amit towards the end of the session. Again, I know this topic is sometimes quite controversial, so do go ahead, ask what you need to ask, and hopefully we'll try and address even the controversial questions as best as we can. I'll hand over now to Michael. He's going to start with a 10-minute presentation highlighting the work of GoodCorporation and the research that they've done, and then we'll initiate a deep dive with Amit. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you find the session to be of value and fruitful for you all. Take care.
Thanks very much, Yasmin, and that's right. I think the more controversial, the better, so keep the questions coming in while we talk. We will collate all of those questions and then answer them one by one when we get to the Q&A session towards the end, which is in the 10 minutes from 1:45. So I'm going to speak very briefly about what we do and the kind of research that we are bringing to the table in this session. This is research we honestly think that you participants can benefit from. It's not just research that's going to sit in our research papers forever. We want to be talking about this. We want people to be learning the kind of lessons that we've seen companies learn over the years. And we do that by assessing. So GoodCorporation is a 20-year-old now assessment and advisory company in the area of business ethics. In that time, we've done well over 600 projects in 85 different countries. So we have a lot of data on which to draw. And it's some of that data that we're going to be talking about today, which we think will be of interest for companies, especially if they are attempting to set up robust compliance systems, and especially in that tricky area of risk assessment. In the area of anti-bribery and corruption specifically, it's well over 100 assessments that we've done now on the ground worldwide, and that's the kind of experience that we want people to benefit from today. In terms of what we're talking about today then, risk assessment, there's some definitions here taken from the guidance on the UK Bribery Act. Now, we're a UK company, but we are not a UK operating company. We work all over the world, and so this definition is just one, but it's a good starting point to get the ball rolling. We're looking here at assessments of companies of their exposure to bribery risk, whether it's internal or external, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means in practice. It should be helping companies to identify their risks, but crucially to develop procedures to mitigate those risks, procedures which are tailored to the risks that that company faces. They should be not just one-off, but periodic, because the world changes. They should be well informed, so looking at internal, external sources, and they should be well documented. So we should be able to show that we have done an anti-bribery and corruption risk assessment once we have done one. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that the regulatory landscape in this area is constantly changing. Okay, so we all know there's increasing pressure on companies to prove that they have good anti-bribery and corruption systems in place. We all know that the risks now are clear, and that companies who get this wrong are facing fines, are facing prosecutions, and are facing reputational damage. So the willingness is there to do better. We also know that this is an area of focus. Risk assessments feature strongly in many different areas of legislation, not just the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, but in the UK, the UK Bribery Act, and some guidance by the DOJ, the Department of Justice in the US, talks about risk assessments as being the starting point. And they are the starting point because without one, we don't know what we need to put in place. Without one, we don't know what's going on, and we don't know how we can respond to the world around us and make sure that our bribery and corruption risks are mitigated. I think in terms of the UK Bribery Act, when that first came out, people weren't sure how the government was going to prosecute against companies in this area, but there have been enough scandals since then to show that these regulations do have teeth. I'm thinking of situations like Rolls-Royce, who were accused not just of paying bribes, but of failure to prevent bribes being paid. And a risk assessment in terms of the DOJ and in terms of the UK regulators, that's the starting point of how you prevent the bribes taking place in the first place. It's become more interesting recently with the introduction of new laws in France in the past few years, the past 3 or 4 years, which make this whole area more prescriptive. So instead of talking about what you shouldn't do, i.e. paying bribes, laws are being more specific now about do a risk assessment, map your risks, make sure these risk assessments are comprehensive, formalized, adaptable to the circumstances. This used to be about something that was preventative, but now it's about something very specific which companies have to do. And in terms of how we address this, we have a long framework of best practice criteria which takes into account all of those laws that I've talked about, the UK Bribery Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, and the Loi Sapin-2 in France. And it becomes a kind of checklist of best practices that companies should be adopting. It covers lots of different areas. One of them is due diligence, which we covered last week, but crucially, one of them is risk assessment. And so we have been assessing companies for the past 10, 20 years, not just on their anti-bribery and corruption controls generally, but on their risk assessment controls specifically. And when we do that, we give them a grade. So we check what they have in place, whether it's a policy or a system or records. And once we've identified that, we give them a grade. And once we've graded well over 100 companies now, we can show how those companies look compared with each other. This graph shows how all of our assessed companies compare with each other. The green showing the level of adequate procedures as a percentage, the red showing the level of inadequate procedures as a percentage. And back to my point earlier about companies getting the message, the companies at the top there are usually companies who have had a problem in the past, and they're now doing everything they can to get better. Those are the companies that really make changes. But you don't have to go through a scandal to make changes. We can make changes right now, and that's one of the things we want to help with in this webinar. And when we're doing our assessments, we're using our framework, but we're also using an awareness of key requirements in the area of risk assessment. And there's certain key things that we look for, i.e., firstly, systematic identification of external risks. So country risk, the fact that we work in, I don't know, Venezuela. Sectoral risk, the fact that we work in government mining contracts in Venezuela. Transaction risk, so the fact that we're constantly paying for licenses to operate. The company's doing these things, then its risk inherently in these areas is higher. Business opportunity risk is the fourth one there. So the fact that we are dealing with opportunities that come and go over long periods of time and are very high value, therefore putting more pressure on us to do everything we can to win, that's a high risk. And business partnership risk. So if we rely as a company on lots of and a whole army of intermediaries or fixers or lobbyists in a country, that would be a business partnership risk. But all of those things are external. Those are things that are going on around us. But crucially, risk assessments need to take into account what happens inside as well, what happens inside the business. So things like lack of employee training. If we are working in Venezuela, when was the last time we did anti-bribery and corruption training for our guys over there? Things like bonus culture, which rewards excessive risk taking. If we have sales agents that don't get paid until they close a deal, that would be very high risk, and we need to take that into account. Lack of clear financial controls. So the idea that payments can be maybe made by anybody at any time. And crucially, a lack of any top management commitment in this area would be a risk. If employees don't know what's expected of them, that's a risk that comes from within the company. And as I said, the law is getting more prescriptive on this, and there are certain key things that companies have to include now if they're going to achieve best practice and meet the requirements in this area. Things like oversight. So somebody needs to be in charge of this. It needs to be somebody's baby. Somebody needs to be making the changes. Resourcing, it's going to require some manpower to do this properly. Internal and external sources of information. So we don't just read a Transparency International report and then never look at the reports or the reports that we have coming from within the business itself. And documentation. So we need to show our working. We need to show what we've done in the area of risk assessment and not just say that we've done it. And finally, on the risk assessment front, in the end, is we need to make sure that we have measured our risks and then adopted practices which fit with those risks. So it's not just about doing a risk assessment and then forgetting about it. We need to use the information we have from the risk assessment to prioritize which risks we address and in what order. And our findings in terms of our research on this over the past 10 years and well over 100 assessments show that risk assessment is one of the third worst areas of practice in terms of all the different areas of good practice that we look at. So it's in the top three there, the other two being due diligence, which we looked at last week, and communication and training, which we'll look at next week. Risk assessment is consistently judged to be inadequate in our assessments, but crucially, the difference between the dark red and the light red is that this has not changed. Between 2014 and 2019, companies didn't get any better in our assessments in terms of the way they evaluate their risks. And what this chart shows is that in our assessments, there's a huge gap between that top quartile and that bottom quartile. The top quartile is the light green, the bottom quartile is the dark green. So the very best companies we assess, they only had 6% of inadequate procedures when it came to risk assessment in general. That's compared with 78% of inadequate procedures when it came to the bottom quartile. So the gap between the companies doing this well and the companies doing this badly, in our experience, is huge. But what it shows also is that companies can improve. You know, there are companies doing this very well. There are examples of good practice, and it doesn't go wrong every time. So let's look at some of the areas where it does most often go wrong. These are 3 areas that we've identified as being the key pitfalls. Often, our clients or the companies we deal with do risk assessments which are too high level, too generic, and that undermines the whole process. A detailed risk assessment will focus on levels of granularity in terms of bribery and corruption risk. And it doesn't have to be a standalone risk assessment. It can be part of the overall corporate risk assessment. But what we find when we look at corporate risk assessments overall is that sometimes bribery and corruption is in there as maybe 5 words or 1 sentence. It shouldn't be like that. If we're going to incorporate it into the corporate risk assessment, that is fine, but we need to make sure it has the level of detail required so that we can make appropriate changes. Secondly, there is a confusion among a lot of the companies we deal with between inherent and residual risk. And this comes back to the point I made earlier about risks which are external and risks which are internal. The fact that we work in a highly corrupt country, that's something external to the business. But the fact that we have no training for our guys in that country, that's another kind of risk altogether. And people get confused about bribery risk, i.e. the risk that we pay a bribe, and regulatory risk, i.e. the risk that we have no system in place to prevent that bribe being paid. And under lots of different legislations, you can be fined for not having the correct procedures in place, or you can not have the appropriate defense in the English system, for example, if you don't have those systems in place. It's not just about where we are, it's about what we're doing internally to address that. And then finally, on the bad practices, so a risk assessment shouldn't be something that we do and then we write it down and put it in a drawer for 5 years and forget about it in case the investigators come round knocking on our door. If the coronavirus has shown us anything, it's that the world and the risks in the world are changing all the time. So risk assessments need to be updated to meet that constantly changing demand because our exposure is always changing. So rather than leaving a risk assessment in a drawer to gather dust for 5 years, we need to be constantly updating it and constantly updating our procedures on that basis. And finally, the best risk assessments that we see, so the best practices in this that we come across in our work, are systematic. They're systematic not just in terms of the kind of issues that they cover, but also in terms of the key areas of the business that they take into account, the size of the business, the structure of the business, the sector we work in, the locations where we work. And systematic is also making sure that this happens systematically. So making sure that it is regularly redone so that we can make the corresponding changes in our internal systems. And so I'm going to wrap up just by saying that those are the key considerations we'd like to give you today. Making sure we know that there is increasing pressure in this area in general. Making sure we know that risk assessment is just the starting point, and it's described in exactly that way by the Department of Justice in the US in relation to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We need to know that the requirements in this area are becoming more prescriptive. This is about what we do instead of what we don't do. And in terms of key takeaways, let's make sure that risk assessments are systematic, as we said, and regular, that they take into account both internal and external risks. So remember the example of we work in Venezuela, but do we have any training for our guys in Venezuela? 2 different kinds of risk. And it needs to have proper oversight. Somebody needs to be in charge, needs to have proper resourcing. People need to be able to devote their attention to this, and it needs to be properly documented. It shouldn't be too high level or generic. It needs to be able to pick up specific and more granular risks. And crucially, finally, it needs to be followed up. Remember that risk assessment in the drawer gathering dust for 5 years. We don't want any of those. We need risk assessments that are being updated constantly because the world is changing constantly. And if we're going to avoid risk, which is what we're really trying to do here, we need to make sure that our procedures are being constantly updated as well. So Amit, I'm going to turn to you now because I've done a lot of talking there, and I think one of the things participants are going to benefit from most in this session is the kind of insight that you bring. So I'd like to hear more about your area of work. You've heard about my area of work. I'd like to know more about how anti-bribery and corruption specific risk assessments, what I've been talking about, would feature in your area of work.
Sure, yeah, and thank you, Michael, for that wonderful presentation as well. So look, to kind of get right into the meat and potatoes of it, it's probably helpful just to give a quick overview of what we do. So the business that I run is a global business, and our clients are also global. They are in almost every jurisdiction on earth, including emerging markets, including some of the ones that you mentioned by way of example. And of course, the business of the bank is money, which is something that is uniquely, if you will, attractive to people that are looking to engage in corrupt practices, and actually quite attractive to individuals who think that it's a good way potentially to not just seek bribes, but also potentially to launder the source of their ill-gotten gains, right? So financial institutions generally are seen as a desirable target, often seen as a soft target by these types of individuals. And they are not just persistent, but they're quite cunning, and they are creative in their attempts to utilize our institution, and actually any other institution like ours, for the purposes of furthering their illegitimate purposes. So if you look at exactly, if you look at what we do, right? So part of what investment banks do is we transform risk. We take risk from different areas of markets, whether it's foreign exchange, whether it's interest rate. We have clients that have exposures to those, and they come to us and they say, look, can you help me to fix a problem that I have? I might have assets and liabilities all over the world in different currencies, all kinds of exposures. Can you help me to figure out a way to make these do what I need them to do? They might have a project somewhere that might involve moving a commodity from one country to another. Commodities in particular, as you can imagine, are something that are often subject to a lot of corruption and bribery type concerns. So, and the numbers that we're talking about are quite large, right? So these are the kind of things that will make a headline on any given day. So what we do is whenever we approach our business, this probably plays a bit into some of the things you'll want to talk to later, but it used to be that these were things that were sort of put on the side of a desk and didn't really necessarily get the attention they deserved. That has changed tremendously, I think, not just because of the legislation that you mentioned, but actually that legislation, I think, is a reflection of a change in values and culture globally around the acceptability of what historically may have been cultural practices. It wasn't that long ago, well within living memory of many of the people on this call, that business in many parts of the world often involved an envelope stuffed full of cash. It kind of reminds me a bit of that scene in the Shawshank Redemption where there's a little pie and it's got some cash in it, and that wasn't that far off the truth. It's evolved a bit since then. When people try and engage in corruption in my space now, it's not always going to be that direct, right? But you mentioned something earlier, and I saw that in your procedures as well, your framework. Hospitality, which some parts of the world really pride themselves on, can take the form of an acceptable level of hospitality, but can also go perhaps well beyond that. And it can be very hard to distinguish the two. And just to give some flesh on the bones of that, there was a time when being offered a golf membership was considered to be quite a decent thing to do from a business point of view, or at least a few rounds of golf. Doing it in Japan in the late 80s and 90s was tantamount to transferring a couple of million yen or a couple $100,000 to someone's bank account. It was a way of doing business, but it didn't necessarily mean that it was necessarily appropriate. So what we do in our business, we are I guess, acutely aware of sort of the need to engage in ABC type assessments, overall risk assessments. We look at it very much holistically. So we look at every single aspect, not just of what we do, but very critically, it's important to remember we're just part of an ecosystem. So we need to look at the people that we work with. Something that I saw in your framework, which I thought was well brought out and properly, quite germane, is you have to think about this. Who am I working with? Who am I perhaps giving money to, and what are they doing with my money? Because you have, at least not just in our business, I think, but very much so in banks, because we operate in an environment of trust, where trust is absolutely and reputation is almost everything. It doesn't really help your cause very much if you do something either knowing or kind of turning a blind eye to the idea that someone else might be doing something inappropriate with it. It will, you can be absolutely sure, flow uphill. and that tar, once it's stuck to you, it's quite difficult to wipe it off. So we look at the transactional work we do. We look at sort of the basics, the structures, and we look at things like, why is our client seeking to do this? Is what they're doing a legitimate aim? Is it justifiable economically? Does the explanation they've given us, does it actually make sense? These are not secondary considerations. These are first order considerations that come to our head immediately upon approaching a project with a client. We look at who we're going to be asked to deal with. We certainly look at the jurisdictions. Now, that's not to say that we say no to somebody, to working with people just because of where they may be based or where their businesses may be based. What it means is that we seek to be intelligent and dynamic and agile around understanding that risk and choosing how we approach it, how we engage with it. And I think, and this may become, I guess, perhaps more clear as we discuss, but there is no world that you can live in where everything is going to be black and white, right? It is just shades of grayness. And it's how you approach that uncertainty that really distinguishes the organizations that do this well and the ones that don't. So I'd like to say, I think perhaps for my bank anyway, we try and do we rely not just on the processes and the checklists and all of that, which we have lots of, and we have adequate resources, but there's also a culture of compliance, a culture of risk awareness, which is, I think, perhaps more critical than anything else, that we've done a lot of work, a tremendous amount of work to embed within the organization so that the people that are on the front lines, the ones who will actually be facing off against these risks, know how to see them, know what to do when they see them, and have confidence that they can escalate that and get the right result, right? You don't want to tell people to do the right thing, but then make them suffer the consequences of their good behavior. That's all too common, I think, and something that also bears watching. So we take all that into account in the work that we do. Yeah.
And so there are so many points that you raised there, which I could follow up with other questions, but I'm going to sort of go through them one by one. When you talked about, you made an interesting point about we don't live in a black and white world, and that's absolutely right. And we live in a world with various different shades of grey, and it strikes me that you've got the manpower that I talked about, you've got the machinery and the oversight within HSBC to see, or in your area of work, to see where the different shades of grey are, and you can see who's maybe the blackest of the black and the whitest of the white, and you can see everything in between. And once you've done that, once you've identified the different levels of risk in different areas, how do you, in your area of work, decide where to start? Where do you go from there? Once you've got that kind of good oversight, how do you start to prioritize what you give your attention to first, second, third, etc.?
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. It's quite a thoughtful one. I think you mentioned in one of your papers that what you don't want to do is try and boil the ocean, right? So, the issue can quickly become so large, especially in larger organizations, and so complex that it becomes intractable. And you don't want to end up in that space, not least of which is because, you will find it frustrating and that disincentivizes people from doing the right thing. What we try and do is there's obviously a process we go through of trying to tier the risk and try and identify priorities, etc. As you said, there are some things that are quite obvious, and I think the first part of that is to tackle those head on, for a number of reasons, not just because they're kind of the obvious thing to do, but also super critically, right? You mentioned it, I think your TC3 in your framework, right, is that there has to be high level ownership about these things. There has to be high level commitment to taking and grasping the nettle on things that may impact your business, right? So if people see management at the initiation saying, look, here's a difficult call, and we're taking that call, that resonates right down the food chain. And that sets the tone for what follows, right? I think in terms of kind of building out sort of a process or building out a universe of what we do in our space, we've done it in an iterative way. We had some very obvious things. Granularity is key. We've given ownership. So we give the right training, we give the right background to people. We ask people in the business to go and dig in, tell us they are the experts. We ask them to come to us. And by setting a tone at the top that says, hey, we are willing, able, and to listen, and we will back you, you get the granularity that you need, right? So you have to certainly split it into smaller parts. I think you have to be sure to prioritize, which requires understanding your business, the area that you do, and understanding first of all where the largest risks are. It's like chasing rats. You are never ever going to exterminate the entire problem, but you can absolutely bring it to level where A, the hygiene level is high enough that you're satisfied with it, and people are confident that you've got enough trap set that you can keep the place reasonably clean, and they want to do business with you as a result, right? So I think that's how we try and tackle what could otherwise be, frankly, an overwhelming problem. I think you have to reduce it to prioritize and then split it into the manageable, chewable bits.
And so let's think about the other point that you raised then, which I thought was really interesting, which was the culture point, and the idea that, you know, every team, whether it's a team of thousands of people or a team of tens of people, is going to be made up of the rats that you talked about and the hygienists that you talked about. You know, there's going to be plenty of rats and cleaners in every organization. And one of the things we like to think about is the idea that the culture of the business can be a bribery risk in itself. And I'd be interested to know more, you know, if you could expand on the point you made earlier about how you deal with that. If you're thinking about culture being one of the key decisive factors in whether something goes wrong or goes right, how are you addressing that?
Yeah, look, it is probably the hardest part to fix or to focus on. You can write papers all day long, but changing human behavior, that's the hard thing. I think the axiom that you have to follow there is that you can only lead by example, right? You can change yourself, you can't change others. You can bring tools to bear, there can be threats of dismissal, reduction in pay, all of this kind of stuff. But you know, people tend not to respond in the best or most positive way to sticks. It's not really the most motivational tool, right? I think if you want to set a culture, the first thing that has to happen is that management, hand over heart, have to buy into it and say, this is something that we want to embed within our organization, and that messaging has to come consistently, it has to be clear, it has to be repeated at every available opportunity, and you have to, I think, find a few scalps in the sense that when people engage in good behavior, that has to be held up and celebrated, right? So people see that actually the consequences of good behavior is indeed to be celebrated and get the right result, right? I think where behavior is inappropriate, the first few, the first kind of opportunities you have, that's an opportunity to shape culture, right? Now you can say to people, look, something has gone wrong, let's hang, draw, and quarter these people. Or you could say, well, why did it go wrong? How do you now help us to make it better? You guys were faced with that challenge. Maybe you took the wrong turn on that challenge. How do we now put the entire organization on the right path? I think there is a lot of value in making sure that if organizations are very serious around anti-bribery and corruption, the critical thing they have to understand is that people are fundamentally self-interested, and you have to give them the right incentives to raise issues to you, to come and escalate. In large organizations, we cannot be everywhere. Management are never going to be everywhere, right? You've got to trust the troops on the ground, and they have to feel that there's a safe place for them to come. And the only way they're going to feel safe is if they see you doing it, hear it from you, and then actually see others that are in those situations being managed in the appropriate way. You know, we've had real cases in our institution. Everyone has had them, and I remember very clearly in one of those cases, you know, the person concerned and the people concerned were quite naturally really worried, right? They were worried about the basic things you and I would worry about, everyone would worry about. What's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to my reputation? You know, they couldn't care less, frankly, about what's going to happen to the bank. That is number 999 on their list of things they're worried about. And so the first thing we had to do is make sure they understood that we were going to take care of that, right? We're saying, look, something went wrong. Okay, you've brought it to our attention. Now, this is not an opportunity for us to flagellate you about it. We're going to work through it together. That immediate, in that 70 seconds, you can see the entire transformation happening in front of you. Can literally see it in front of your eyes, right? People are going from being scared to, you know, how do we hide, to them thinking, oh, hang on a minute, these people actually have my back. Management are going to stand behind me on this. They're going to help me. And when other people see that happening, then they're the ones who are going to come to you 2 days later and say, you know, can I just talk to you about something? And that is when you know you have actually started on the right path. Super critical that it comes from the top. I think that's one of the key elements.
And it comes back to some of the issues we were discussing earlier about the difference between inherent and residual risk, or internal and external risk. You know, you can massively, if you're working in an area that you know is very tricky or very difficult from a corruption point of view, that's your inherent risk. That's not going anywhere as long as the country stays the same. But you can massively reduce your residual risk, the amount of risk that you as a company are left with later on, if you do all those preventative measures that you talked about. If you send some people in to train them, if you make sure that management commitment is clear, if you make sure they've all got the policies or the e-learning, or you spend a day explaining what the anti-bribery and corruption policy means. What matters at the end of the day will be the risk that you're left with, that residual risk, because inherent risk, it's a much bigger fish to fry. And I think it leads me on to another question that I had for you, Amit, and just to the people playing along at home, as it were, keep your questions coming in, because we're going to be keeping them to answer towards the end. And when I think about those tricky areas, and when I think about those areas where bribery and corruption legislation might be weaker, for example, or less well enforced, does that come into your area with your lawyer hat on? And Amit, you have a lot of hats, but with your lawyer hat on, are you avoiding jurisdictions that have weak anti-bribery and corruption laws? I guess if you're working deliberately in emerging markets, then you can't. And I'd be interested to know how you deal with that.
Yeah, look, very relevant for those of us in Dubai, many of the people that are probably dialed into this call. I think the answer is no, we don't avoid them. Look, there's some bright lines that we can't cross. There are certain entities that are sanctioned, certain countries that are sanctioned, and we abide by all of those rules, okay? But that leaves a huge universe of the rest of the world where perhaps standards and business practices are different from the ones we would want. So we certainly are willing to engage with them. We do, in fact. We are conscious of the differing sort of value systems in terms of both cultural approaches and people's perception of what might be right or wrong versus the standard that we have set internally for our organization. And one of the, you actually alluded to it earlier, and I think it was really good that you did. Once you've kind of set that perception internally in an organization, you're not the only ones. We all live in kind of glass houses. So others see that too. So when you're in these jurisdictions where perhaps people are very traditionally expecting an envelope of cash or whatever it might be, or some very expensive entertainment, but they know that your institution does not engage in that behavior, they just don't ask, right? So you kind of kill two birds with one stone. They know that that's not going to be on the table. Now, it might be that some people don't want to deal with you as a result, and we are 1000% okay with that as an organization. But it's also a question of saying, look, you have to be sensitive, of course, in all cases to the region you're in, and you have to accept that you're not always going to get it right. That's okay too, right? It's what you do after you haven't gotten it right, in terms of sometimes there's not much that can be done to fix it. You just have to at least give people confidence, your regulators confidence that you're watching, you caught it, you reported it, you managed it. Famously, many years ago in Singapore, I was given some oranges, Chinese New Year. I ate the oranges, unsurprisingly. There were 6 beautiful oranges. And I recall very clearly getting absolutely slapped senseless by my compliance team, who told me that I should have reported it. And I actually thought it was some sort of bad joke at work, because I thought, well, it's like cookies. Someone gave me cookies for Christmas. Of course I ate the cookies. And no, I didn't tell you. I'm very sorry. Did you want some? But what they told me was, in fact, these oranges, because they're grown on special trees and basically babied, were worth about $30 or $40 US each, and at that time sufficient to cross the barrier of our reporting threshold. So my email back to them when they inquired about it, saying, "What did you do with the oranges?" saying I ate them, did not go down particularly well. But it's a good example to show how, look, these things can happen in a very inadvertent way. That's perhaps a sort of fun example. But what can you do? I can't bring back the oranges, can I? So what we did is, we raised the report, we escalated a little bit. Was it because people were so worried that I was being bribed by oranges? I don't think so. What we were trying to do is to say, look, we take it seriously enough that we try and, as you say, document it, track it, have processes in place. So if someone goes, actually those weren't $20 oranges, they were the super, $20,000 oranges, we can say, oh, okay, at least we knew about the oranges, right? So yep. I think that's, it's part of that culture and embedding it in the organization.
Okay, first controversial question of the day comes from me, but I'm going to pick up on your oranges. I'm going to pick you up by the oranges there, Amit, and I'm going to ask, if we're thinking about the region we're in, if we're thinking about the region many of our participants are in, and we're thinking about the Middle East, what are our oranges? What are our cultural things which are going on all the time, which would not pass muster when it comes to proper anti-bribery and corruption controls, whether it's a gift and hospitality, custom, or whatever? What key things should we be looking at as risks when we're thinking about this environment?
I think there's the obvious ones. You know, the Middle East, a culture that very much prides its culture of hospitality, and rightly so. I think in large part, in my experience, that's done in kind of a appropriate way, sometimes a lavish way, but you know, nothing that could really be criticized for being anything other than lovely. I think the risk comes in the nature of personal interaction. Historically, a lot of regions, not just this one, business was very much a sort of person-to-person, who you know, family relationships, you know, quite a, if you will, an insulated system. And what we have seen is a preference when dealing with certain parties, you know, and they don't necessarily see that they're doing it in an inappropriate way. They'll say, look, well, why don't we go to so-and-so for this part of the deal, or why don't we engage, you know, these guys, or, you know, I've worked with these guys for a long time, why don't we just hand them the whole contract? You know, some of that on some level is largely driven by people's preference to deal with people they know, people you trust, and that's not to say that that is in any way wrong, but we always approach it with a bit of a critical eye, right? You know, is there a case to be made for farming out the work? I'll give you an example from the legal sphere. Actually, people might think it's all as clean as it gets, but look, you know, when we award contracts for some of the more complex structures, the fees on those structures can come in the millions of US dollars, right? So a plum cherry for any particular partner or law firm to land, plus to have our name on, you know, that we've done this deal, etc. And of course, I have lawyers that I work better with than others, some who are friends, some of whom I went to school with. All of that's true. So when it comes to appointing counsel on a particular transaction, I might feel that I want to work with somebody in particular. But actually what we've done is to make it, and not just to make it fair for us and for our clients, but also to make it fair for the people we work with, because they're suppliers, right? Suppliers also want to feel that they're being treated fairly. So before we award a deal, we have a process where it has to be quoted for by at least 2 other firms. And the whole purpose of that is so that my institution has an ability to see, are we getting value for money? Our partners also have the ability to say, look, I get a bite at the table. It's not just about taking Amit out for an expensive drink every day, or, you know, inviting to an expensive Eid meal. We're going to get the phone call to quote for business irrespective. And lastly, it provides transparency for others in the business, right? So they're looking at us and they're saying, you know, you're asking me to pay, you know, $2 million for something, a solution. Is that they don't have a sense of whether the number is right and wrong. And it's in that gray space that corruption can easily happen. It can be kind of very small corruption or the big kind. But you can see there that, you know, if you're going to be diligent about managing this kind of risk, you kind of have to really kind of make it literally part of your DNA, I think, as you look through it.
And that diligence point is really interesting, because I think a lot of companies think that, a lot of companies that we deal with that are not doing anything in this area, they think it's a big, complex job that's going to take forever to achieve, and too many people and too much money and too much time. But what we would say is 2 things. Number one, it can be done quite effectively if you're systematic about it, if you're sensible and you take into account in an effective way what you know about the environment you're in, and what you know about the systems that you have in place. And secondly, risk assessments, if they're done well, yeah, they cost a bit of time and they cost a bit of money, but these are things that will save us a lot more time and a lot more money at the end of the day, and a lot more trouble than if we don't do anything at all. So I think, you know, people, and I hope that this goes for the people participating in this webinar, shouldn't be afraid of doing a risk assessment, right? It's not as difficult as people think, and it does, at the end of the day, save a lot more time, money, and trouble than it causes.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, look at the examples of Wirecard, look at VW, look at potentially Nikola, look at WeWork. You know, if you wanted a salutary lessons on the value of good due diligence, not just ABC, but the whole 9 yards, but this is certainly a part of it, right? You know, you don't need to look very far, and the opportunity cost to investors, businesses, banks. It's in the tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think, it's like if you're, there's a problem, you've got to do something about it, even if it's a small start, because it will eventually get you down the road. Doing nothing is absolutely, must necessarily be the worst outcome of all, because no one can argue that they're not pregnant with the knowledge that there's an issue. So if one day you're challenged to say, what did you do about it? And your answer is, well, nothing. I don't know how you can credibly make that argument to anyone that matters.
Exactly. And that it comes back to one of the things we were talking about at the beginning, that if you take the French example as one of the most recent examples of legislation in this area, they're actively fining people for what they don't do. They're fining people for not doing this kind of stuff. That's on the French side. And on the UK side, in the UK Bribery Act, it just prevents you from having that reasonable defense of, I had adequate procedures in place. If you're not doing anything, then you can't possibly say I had adequate procedures in place to prevent this, because you had nothing in place. And I think before I turn to the questions coming in from the audience, I'm going to put one last question to this part of the discussion, which is, you talked a bit in our discussion about the way things have changed. And if you were looking ahead for the next 5-10 years, we're going to be coming out of, we hope, one of the biggest pandemics in human history. And in the area that we're talking about, people are talking a lot more these days about things like automated solutions for this kind of thing, and different metrics. So things like ESG, environment, social and governance metrics for the kind of partners that we work with, for example. Where do you see this going in the next 5-10 years, this kind of debate?
Well, I think, it's probably self-evident on some level that this is an improving space, right? So these issues are becoming top and center, however, whatever label you want to attach with them. You asked me earlier as a lawyer what my views were. I remember, as a lawyer, you have professional and legal obligations. I remember some of these issues that I perhaps was forced to struggle with in my own head at the start of my career are things I can now talk openly about within my businesses to the people I work with and for, and have them treat them with I think the respect that they deserve. Perhaps historically they got a little more lip service rather than action. But look, that's the evolution of good behavior in the world, despite what the news wants to tell us. It tends to always, it's trending to getting better. Going forward, I think, if you run a business and you are unable to demonstrate, well, I think there's a couple of things. First, if you're unable to demonstrate that you onboard best practice of this in this space, you're going to have a lot harder time getting banked. Okay, that's a fact. So if you need money and you come to a bank and you can't answer some basic questions around ABC practice, you're going to have a hard time getting lending. Okay, you're going to have a much harder time finding counterparties to deal with. I think also, and again, I raised the example of the companies I mentioned earlier. This kind of due diligence goes hand in hand with a lot of other kinds of due diligence. But what you find is, it's the petty graft that often is the red flag for the bigger stuff. So if you're doing your diligence correctly with your suppliers, people you work with, your employees on the ABC part, you're probably potentially saving yourselves billions. There's if some of these organizations had looked at the bank accounts of some of the people they were dealing with, and why they seem to be living a lifestyle that seemed well out of proportion to what they were getting paid, you might say, well, where did they get that money? And then it would become kind of obvious that something else was going on. So I think this is a conversation that is not just not going to go away. It is going to be something. It's going to end up being. It's kind of like the internet, right? It's the days of being a granddad saying, I don't understand them computers. Those days are gone, and they are rapidly approaching extinction. So something to be very aware of and alive to.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. This is the whole issue of risk assessment is not a conversation that's going to be going away. But to the participants of the webinar, this conversation is going to be going away in about the next 10 minutes, this specific one. So looking at some of your questions now as the next step, we've had a question in from a participant called Mark, who wants to know, when we look at embedding risk assessments and embedding management of risks, while we're coping with issues of business continuity in such unprecedented times, how are we going to do that? And I'm gonna give the GoodCorporation view on this, or my view as a GoodCorporation employee on this first, and then hand over to Amit, which is to say that we are living in unprecedented times, but as a company that makes its living by helping companies to assess risks in these areas, it's important for us to say that we've almost never been more busy. We've never been more inundated with requests for the kind of services we provide. And I think that's because people have learned from the crisis that you just can't predict what's around the corner. And people have learned from the crisis that you need to be incredibly adaptable. And they've learned from the crisis that the only way that you can be adaptable to what's around the corner is if you've got a good oversight of what your risks are. And so of course, we're not getting on planes and flying around the world to go and do this for 2 weeks on site in Guatemala or Venezuela or Congo at the moment. We can't travel. But we're doing a lot of work in the assessment space, just using this, by talking to computer screens like I'm doing to you right now, by setting up file sharing systems so that we can read all of a company's policies in one go if we need to, by doing training, which is not just, flying to Cairo and spending a day in a hotel lobby. We're doing training which is like this, using slides on the screen, cameras, lights, camera, action, etc. I would say that the risks have not gone away. If anything, people's awareness of risks and the need to be adaptive and a need to be adaptable has increased. But us as assessors, as risk assessors, we've had to adapt as well. Are there any thoughts on Mark's question from your side, Amit?
Yeah, look, I agree with everything you've said. I think COVID has made a lot of these risks very acute. I'll give you, I'm sitting in front of my computer setup at the moment. You guys can't see it, but I could, in theory, enter a series of transactions for a few $1 billion and potentially be on a plane before anyone caught me. COVID means that a lot of people are working from home. The scope potentially for corruption, for graft, for all kinds of inappropriate behavior potentially is increased. I don't think, frankly, I'm a bit of an optimist. I don't think most people have taken advantage of that, but there are some, and there are always bad actors that seek to monetize the opportunity, right? Who would monetize any opportunity. I think so. Mark's question really is I think very relevant. It's very timely. I think the core thing you have to remember, right, and it fits neatly into that conversation we had at the very beginning, is if you approach this problem or had approached in advance, you might be well on your way to embedding that culture, which helps to mitigate a lot of these risks. Even if you're just starting today, right? Even just starting that conversation does two things. Not only does it help kind of build the framework for the future, but also, to the degree that people might be engaging in these kinds of behaviors or thinking about it, knowing that people are talking about it is a great disincentive, right? You're not going to go around doing the naughty things when you know the cops are looking, right? So I think there's a bit of that that's worth kind of bearing in mind. I think COVID has, from the way we work, has definitely created a lot more risk, but I think also a lot more opportunity, right? In order to manage a lot of businesses, I think that used to work people to people. A lot of their stuff is online, as you alluded to earlier, Michael. It also makes it easier to monitor all of that, right? Because now there are records, there's videos, there's phone calls, there's text, there's all of that. Whereas before maybe it was happening in a dirty corner of an industrial area somewhere. So you have to also seize that opportunity.
Mm. Yeah, because that's a really interesting point, isn't it? If we're communicating a lot more these days by, I don't know, Teams or email or chat or WhatsApp, etc., then a lot more is being written down now than it was when it was a bunch of guys in a room having a conversation, hoping they couldn't be overheard. And I guess there's a million ways that people can encrypt their messaging and try to keep things off the record. But there are also plenty of areas now where we can view and read a lot more of what's going on between people, and that's part of another part of what we do is to investigate when things go wrong, and a lot of that is based on trawling through terabytes and terabytes of email data, when there's more and more of that these days because people are sat at home doing what we're doing. So Mark's very happy with that answer. So I'm going to look at some other questions coming in then. One question is about the basic kind of monetary impact of this. If because of COVID, companies are struggling and there's less money going around and everybody's trying to do things more quickly and more cheaply because they don't know what's around the corner and they know that they made a huge loss this year and they don't know how they're going to recover. if we're thinking about the resourcing of risk assessments, and we're thinking about how much manpower and finance we have to spend on this, do you think risk assessments are in danger of being forgotten because everybody's trying just to survive?
Yeah, look, people will ultimately have to choose their priorities, and sure, this may or may not figure on someone's high level. But I would just make 2 quick points. Look, you don't have to make a mountain out of a molehill, right? You know your business probably better than anyone else, so it's possible to take simple steps to look into this issue. And let me ask you this: if not now, if your business is struggling, and many businesses are, and you are bleeding money around the edges to people, let's say in the most obvious case around bribes, wouldn't you want to put a stop to that? Right? I mean, at the time you can least afford it. Now, I take the point that there may be a desire to cut corners to get things done just to survive. And maybe there are probably fact patterns where it would be difficult to judge an individual and the choices they made, other than with perfect hindsight. But I would say, it's one of these cases, and at least in my experience, once you drink from that cup, the poison spreads. There's no way to stop. Once you get into bed with people on that basis, there's nothing to stop them asking you for another couple of $1,000 or a couple of €100,000. You might think you're doing the right thing because you need your business to survive, but at what point do you stop? Right now, you're on that, what in lawyer terms we call a very, very slippery slope. And before you do that, you really want to kind of think very, very hard about whether or not that's the kind of universe you want to live in, if those are the kind of people you want to be dealing with. And the answer for me, perhaps made easier by the fact that I've got a large balance sheet behind me, is no. But I would really encourage people to think about this. Ultimately, you answer to nobody but yourself, and you have to keep that in mind. You have to also bear in mind, at some point, you might be held to account by, who cares about the court system, who cares about the press, but what about being held to account by the people you love, right? Mm-hmm. So, you want to at least be able to look them in the eye and say, maybe things didn't work out for the business just the way we hoped, but at least you can walk around with your head held high. I don't need to give you the names of the people that are reported every day in the press here and globally who don't do the right thing and then spend the next 40 years of their life trying to recover their lost reputations.
Yeah, and so we've had and some more questions come in. I'm going to try and pick off some of these in the next minute, and then we're going to try and wrap up for the final minute. But there's a question come in from Inji, which is about the policies. And we talked a lot about assessment. But after assessment, what you need to do is set up appropriate policies to deal with these things. And she's asking if policies internally within companies are changing to address things like COVID. So are whole different policy sections being addressed to deal with after effects of a global pandemic? And from our experience, I can say that a lot of the work that we're getting asked to do now isn't just about assessments. It's also about, I need somebody to look at my my code of conduct. I need somebody to look at my bribery policy. I need to look at somebody to look at all my compliance policies, because I know the world's never going to be the same again. And we're doing a lot more of that kind of policy development work. And of course, when we're doing it, we're helping people to incorporate risk of global pandemic and how to emerge from COVID-19 as a company that dealt with it properly. So there are undoubtedly in the policy areas going to be new areas of best practice. We talked about a lot of best practice today, but new areas of best practice coming out of COVID-19 are going to be things like, did I look after my smaller suppliers? Did I instigate family-friendly policies for people who had kids running around the house all day while they were trying to work from home? Did I put in place systems to check in with people who are remote working to avoid things like mental health problems and isolation? I would say, in answer to Ingi's question, yes, we are definitely seeing more policy development in this area. And just before we wrap up, Amit, do you have any thoughts on that area?
Yeah, look, you have a condition in your framework, SM7, that talks, so just to make it kind of precise, talks about remuneration. So yes, we are changing policies, all the things you've mentioned. We're also changing policies and look at things like remuneration, right? So as you said, how much do people get paid based on the value and their behaviors? So conduct and behaviors become a huge part of that conversation. It's been part of the conversation for a long time, but we take into account the COVID situation as well. There's a lot of desperation in the world right now, which is an unfortunate place to be. So we need to re-articulate consistently the message to our employees that, look, this is something that you are going to be held to account on and rewarded for as well. Super critical to note that its remuneration goes hand in hand.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's a really good way to wrap up then. This isn't just about doing things wrong and getting punished for it. It's about doing things right. You've seen from the data I've given you and the data we've discussed in the panel, which has been fantastic today, the fact that a lot of companies aren't getting this right. A lot of companies are still doing this wrong, but risk assessment is absolutely crucial, and it is a first step if we're going to combat corruption and set up those robust compliance systems that these webinars are all about. So I'm going to leave those key takeaways on the screen there, just to say that let's make sure our risk assessments are systematic, regular, that they include internal and external risks, somebody's in charge of it, that we have appropriate resourcing to take care of it, that it's not too high level or generic, and crucially that we don't leave it there. Risk assessment is the first step, and so after we've done a risk assessment, we need to make sure we respond to it. And next week, we'll be talking about the role of communication and training in developing an appropriate compliance system. This is all going to be helping in the fight against corruption. And so I would encourage everybody that's attended the session today to tune in next week, same time, to hear us talk about the communication and training element. But in terms of wrapping up, I would just say thanks very much, Amit, for your contributions. It's been a fantastic conversation. I really hope that participants have benefited from the massive amount of experience and expertise you brought to the table today. And I very much hope that as a result, they'll join us for the forthcoming sessions. So thanks very much, Amit, and thanks very much everybody else for taking part today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. Take care.